Hello, friends. My name is Steve, and I'm here today with the Friday conversation with a bunch of friends. It's very exciting to be here tonight with all of you. So, Jimmy, you want to kick us off with some introductions?
Me? You want me to do just my own introduction? I hope.
We're going clockwise. Yeah,
Okay,
on
I
the
thought you
screen.
meant like introduce everybody, like I
You
was the
can
ring
introduce me.
announcer.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah, you can.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
I got
He's so
nervous.
smooth. I would like actually Jimmy to introduce us all. I love his
Yeah.
smooth voice.
Yeah.
I am okay. I'll try.
Yeah,
Why
go
not?
about your DJ days.
Well, our gracious host tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is Steve Talks Books, who is one of my favorite people for long form conversation to watch on the BookTube sphere, YouTube sphere, whatever we want to call it. And next to me up here, I have the wonderful Johanna.
Hello.
And we also are accompanied by the freshly into his 5th decade, Philip Chase. Dr. Philip Chase. I apologize. Doctor. He gets very testy about this.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. Yes, I insist. Yeah.
And then we are all humbled by the presence of one of the greatest of all time, the Mount Rushmore of epic fantasy. Absolutely a placeholder there. And that is the one and the only Steven Erikson.
Hello.
Well asked for it. And I'm Jimmy Nuts.
Mr. Erickson, was that the first time you've ever been introduced with the WrestleMania voice?
Let me think about that. Yeah, probably.
That was a great introduction.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yes,
good
thank
stuff.
Thank you for having me do it.
You set the bar way too high for me, so that's no good. Yeah. So, Stephen, I wanted to ask you. Right, I was just talking with a friend of mine, Katarina, and she's a fan of the series, and she wanted me to ask you about characters.
Mm-hmm.
And she was talking about how complex some characters are. Some characters are very complex and three-dimensional. And there's some characters when it seems like you either want us to love them or hate them. Is there a method to the madness? Are there certain characters that you just don't take the time to flesh out as much, or is there a reason that you want us to enjoy or not enjoy some characters?
No, I don't. I'm not sure if I have any sort of intention of directing the reader to make a decision or a judgment call on a character. Oddly enough, and I'm really experiencing this now because I'm writing No Life Forsaken, and I'm introducing a lot of new characters. Surprise, surprise. And they arrive, and as soon as I start writing them, I realize they are as complex as any character I've ever created. And so I think they're all like that. And then it becomes a question of, well, how much of that character do I want to lay out on the page? And how, I guess one tries then to think, well, how relevant and how important are they going to be to the story? And sometimes as the writer, you don't know how important they're going to become. So based on that past experience, I give them all the room that I can possibly give them, and see where that takes me. And so characters, I mean, there's a couple of characters I've just done that really surprised me where they ended up, and ended up in the sense of pushing their way into the narrative and into the plot in a much broader and more forceful way than I anticipated. So as soon as sometimes I don't have to name the character, but if somebody sort of shows up, as long as I give them the space that they need, they'll sort of decide almost for me whether or not they're going to be relevant to the story, or whether there's something about that character that's that it's just intriguing enough that I know that I'm going to come back to them, or I have the potential of coming back to them. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but it's not a question of really sort of building a character to manipulate the reader in any sense. The character is one. I try to think in terms of the character as a whole individual, and so there's qualities, there's virtues, there's flaws, there's everything there, and then the story and the scene that I'm describing determines how much of that is going to show up on in the book. but it's all there. It all just sort of fills all the empty spaces.
Would there be an example of that perhaps in The God Is Not Willing, with a character who originally appeared in House of Chains as a very minor character? Now, I'm not going to say who, but it was where you had to sort of, I think, ask some of your fans, wait, is this character alive or not?
Yeah, I couldn't remember where I'd left him. I really didn't. But and there's plenty of characters like that in the 10-book series where I've left them to their fates, and in a sense, they are a repository of potential that I can reach back for if I want to. Yeah, I think so.
I have a very odd question to add on to that. And I love how you name your characters. They're among my favorites. Do you start with a name, or do you start with the virtues and then build it out from there and think of what's appropriate?
It varies, but I'd say predominantly I start with the name.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like it.
So I'm actually going onto my work laptop here because I'm going to see if I can what the hell is that? Isn't that weird when you open up your laptop and you don't recognize anything that's just showing up there? Okay, there we go.
Jimmy, have you been hacking?
Talk among yourselves. I'm just going to find something here.
Well, I guess what I'll say about the characters in this series and what I've been telling people who are interested in reading Laws and Book of the Fallen is that with my own personal experience, and of course everybody's going to have a different experience with the series, I didn't really think about the series in terms of being attached to characters when I started it. I was just enjoying the experience, and I was enjoying the characters, but I wasn't thinking, oh, this is my favorite character, or this is my person, or this is my person. I wasn't really thinking in those terms necessarily. But then the more I read on in the series, the more I just found myself reflecting back on certain characters, and they would stay with me after finishing the book. I think that especially happened with the second book, with Deadhouse Gates, where I started thinking back on certain characters, and they just started to have a deeper and deeper impact on me the more and more I thought about it. And then as I read on in the series, so many characters in this series became like favorite characters for me. So many. And I could say more, but I guess I'll just leave it at that for now. That it's interesting because I know there's a lot of talk about how Mawson isn't a character-driven series in the typical sense or traditional sense that we think of fantasy characters with the found family and the small group of characters you attach to. But I think that the way that you write characters, there were characters I fell in love with within a few paragraphs as I was reading on in the series.
Do you have any examples? Like, can you name any? Or
Iron Bars.
Iron Bars.
Yeah, I distinctly remember Iron Bars. Just reading a couple of paragraphs of dialogue in book 5, and it immediately popped out to me. I love this character. I immediately love this character. But as far as characters earlier on, the ones I'm thinking about the most with Deadhouse Gates are Fellison and Coltane. And I can't give away much because of spoilers, but just really thinking deeply about what they went through and their journeys and things that they represented in that story deeply stayed with me. So some characters, I guess, I would say were a little bit more of a slow burn than others. But yeah, there were several characters and several female characters, I should add, like Sarah and Pedek, that I felt such a connection to, that I felt kind of seen through in a weird way, even though I haven't experienced what some of those characters went through.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat by Nathaniel Robinson about the RPGs to think through the stories. And as Johanna was talking, I was thinking about something similar, actually, how a lot of these characters were scripted, if you will, when you and Ian Esselmont did your gaming. So in a way, they're already very much alive. They're very vivid for you in your mind before they're even on the page in your novels. I would guess that plays a huge role in how developed these characters feel for you as an author.
Yeah, I think fewer characters were game than you think. I can probably name, I don't know, 30 characters maybe, maybe 40. And that's including people who are not Cam or myself, but other people that played. Actually, for those, that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters. The rest were me and Cam. But I think both of us, we kind of found ourselves naturally angling away once we've left the history of those particular characters behind. That there was a lot more inventing on the fly, creating characters specific to the stories we were going to be telling. So,
Yeah.
And we did have a question from Matt on Books. Who's your favorite character you've ever written, and why is it Karsa?
well, Karsa, yeah, interesting. I don't know. I guess I don't really have favorites. I know that I have a lot of fun, for example, if I'm writing Isgirl Pust, because it's just fun to write. Crop would be another example. But generally, you just sort of you fall into that character's life as you're writing it, and that's where you want to be at the time. So that becomes your favorite character for that moment. I think it's probably the same with every writer. Otherwise, you're giving them short shrift. You're not giving them the attention and the respect they deserve. So, I mean, Karsa's story is the most linear of all the stories. So maybe that's why he is such a favorite, among readers. I mean, you can see the progression. You see where he begins. Whereas a lot of characters, you're dropped into meeting them for the first time, and they're halfway through their lives, and so. There's all that stuff that as the reader you're not experiencing. So maybe that's what makes Karsa so attractive in that respect.
Yeah, we kind of see his not origin per se, but in origin of Karsa, and get to follow that along. And it also stands out because he is very different from most of the other characters in the series, which makes it even more special, I think, for some people. You talk a lot about like the characters like having all this it really almost feels like agency that you're giving them, that they make these decisions and they kind of lead you. Do you have any, like, if I could drill into that more, like, do you have any tips for that? Like for those who do write, because I feel like a lot of times, whether it be other people talking about the writing or whenever I attempt to write a character, I always feel like I have to give them some quirk or like little characteristic. And then like, you know what I mean? And then it becomes, oh, they're the drunk, or they're the jokester, or they're the badass, or whatever it might be. Is there like a method or a tip that you have to make people feel more real? Because everything in Malazan, even the fantastical, seems rooted. And I think that's an impressive thing.
Right. Well, okay. So when you're talking about introducing a character who, as you say, has a quirk or a trait, are you introducing that character from another point of view or from that character?
That's a good question.
Because if you're doing it from that character, then that quirk is just a starting point, right? And that's a great segue, because I'm going to read you guys something that is in No Life Forsaken. So this is nobody's heard this stuff, and this is basically first draft, because I have a squad. Well, it's a squad and a half in a very remote outpost in the 7 cities. And one of the things that keeps these outposts surviving is a regular supply of beer and ale. And so, and it's all part of the supply train networks that are servicing the borderlands. So this is a scene where I knew I had to get the beer and wine to arrive at the outpost. And I could have stayed with the point of view, any of the point of views that I'd already explored within the squads. But I decided not to. One of the reasons is I knew that I'd set it up so that when the beer and ale arrives, there's not enough of it. And there's not enough of it because the people who are delivering the beer and ale already know the orders that are about to come to these squads before even the squad knows. This is kind of just, how things work in the military. And, people know things long before the orders come down. And so they're actually the better rumor mill or information delivery system. It's actually built into the delivery of these carriages full of ale and beer. So because I needed to get the squad to get out of their outposts and begin a march, and so I decided, okay, what I'll do is I'll take it from the point of view of the people delivering, at least one character, the main character of the train that's delivering the beer and ale. And so I had to basically invent a character on the fly. And that's where ridiculous names can come in very quickly. They just they pop in. So I warn you beforehand. The outpost is called the Gila Outpost, as in Gila Monster. Okay, here's the reading. Wagoneer Buttcrow had piles. In fact, he had piles and piles, and the huge pillow on the bench only managed to keep him from screaming with every bump of the wagon. He hoped there was a decent healer in the miserable outpost ahead. Not that healing lasted very long, since it was his task to deliver vital supplies to all the outposts on this endless, pointless border, which meant he'd spent most of his past 30 years of his life sitting on this damned wooden bench. No human body was meant for that. Standing, walking, running, lying down. These were healthy positions. Sitting was a curse, invented by a cruel, spiteful, malevolent demon god with a vicious sense of humor. Or a terminal case of piles. He wanted to find that demon god. He wanted to kill it slowly, gleefully. That wasn't too much to ask of the universe, was it? Gila Outpost. Buttcrow squinted. And that was another thing, this lifetime of squinting that had made the rest of his face look like an apple left on a shelf for 10 years. And he began altering his idea of the place. Since it was walled and it had outbuildings, and the main building, barring the huge hole in one wall, was looking rather fancy. Typical of Marines to find a spiffy ruin to squat in. Nice cool chambers, feet up on desks and whatnot, living the easy life like they was royalty or something. But oh, they'd been getting thirsty. How else to explain them crowding the gate and all the big smiles on their ugly faces? Aye, beer and wine, vital supplies. But wait until they saw what they were about to see. And was there any doubt that they'd blame Buttcrow? But it wasn't Buttcrow's fault, was it? Would the healer even fix him up? Who could tell how snarky they'd be? Now he was rolling up, and they were wondering at how small this train was. 3 wagons? Where the fuck are the other 2? Well, Buttcrow was nothing if not efficient and practical. It's Buttcrow, one of the Marines said. Hey, Pruneface, how's the piles? At least I'm sitting on mine, Buttcrow replied. And it's not like you can hide your face, is it? The train's short. Buttcrow guided the mules through the gate, pulled the wagon up close to the well, where he set the brake and began climbing down, wincing at every move. The Marines gathered round. Ain't short, he said, knocking the bucket sitting on the edge of the well into the hole, pleased at hearing a soft splash from below. He began cranking the bucket back up. This better be cold, he said, and clean. But if just one, then cold will do. It's all short, somebody cries. The bucket reappeared, and Buttcrow pulled it over, lifted it to drink down 2 mouthfuls of well water. Huh, cold and clean. Damn Marines always had it good, didn't they? He set the bucket on the ground, pulled down his breeches, and sat, pushing his backside into the bucket and feeling that blessed cold, clean water rising up around it. Tight squeeze, but he managed. Now we got to burn that bucket, one of the Marines said. Ask if I care, Buttcrow responded, closing his eyes and sighing. Anyways, you're on the move in a day or 2, and that's why the train's short. A Marine cursed and said, how is it damned nary Cartier knows that when we don't? Buttcrow opened his eyes and glared at the man. Because it's people like me supplying you, so of course we find out first. Logistics, right? You want to be overloaded when you're on the march? With wine and beer? Sure, why not? You got wine and beer, just not so much that you can't carry it all. We're Marines. You'd be surprised at what we can carry, Buttcrow. Buttcrow snorted. He'd heard it all before, but really, who knew better about how things worked? He did, of course. Armies figured they were the reason the Empire survived. They weren't. It was people like Buttcrow and Lilypad on the wagon behind him, and Neelock in the wagon behind her. Wagoneers, haulers, cartiers. Why, they were the Empire's lifeblood, damn it. Without them, it'd all come crashing down. But where was the gratitude? I need healing, he said. And thankfully, the officers had arrived. And it was the captain herself who said, Beland, heal the poor man, will you? I will, sir, once he gets his ass out of that bucket. Lone Rider, coming in, one of the soldiers said. Butt Crow nodded. That'll be your marching orders. Need help here. I'm stuck. So that's to Jimmy's point. If you're going to have a particular quirk or detail about a character that you come up with, so this guy's been sitting on wagon train benches forever, so he's going to have piles. If you're in his point of view, that's your launching point to other details about his internal life.
Yeah.
And in terms of another character observing this, will only know the external. He'll know Butt Crow's got piles. That's about it. But if you're using his point of view, you can then spread your information and drop things out among, in his character's voice, but providing salient points and details, expositional details, but they're all tied into his internal monologue. So basically the section is doing a whole lot of things, even though it's just tied into that one short point of view.
Yeah.
And so having finished that, that's probably the last time we're going to see Butt Crow, but maybe not, because he's there, right? And what I know what he's doing is he's delivering supplies to various places throughout this part of Seven Cities. So there's the opportunity for Butt Crow to show up at any time later on in the book if I want him to. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's like advancing the story too.
Yeah.
I mean that's good stuff. It's like the truckers of Malazan.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so the other two names, I mean, Lilypad, chances are, I can picture it in my head, right? She's been sitting down way too long as well, right? So probably eating all the time. And the other one, knee lock. Well, yeah, the knees will go if you're walking and marching and doing all this kind of stuff. So the names all fit. This is kind of sort of what a troop of these people would be like in terms of their name choices. So
I love it.
Well, he needed someone to invent Preparation H for him or something.
I think so. Desperately so, yeah.
There's an ongoing debate about the spelling of the character's name in the chat. I don't know if you want to settle that for us or not.
Butt Crow, Buttcrow.
That was what people were hoping for.
You just made everybody happy.
Someone said if there are truckers in Malazan, are there also lot lizards?
Are there also what?
Lot lizards.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Oh, man. I just want to read more of that story now.
Me too.
To be honest.
Good. That's a good sign.
Very much liked it.
Now, I told you he'd be awake. What a hoser.
Yeah.
Probably all hopped up on Red Bull. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, though. And I just love the fact that you talked about how it was from Butt Crow's POV.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that he has these this exposition in his thoughts because he's done this time and time again. And I mean, how many times have we done a task at work that is so mundane? And every time you do it, you just think about how much you hate it. And you think about why you hate it. And you think about, why do I have to do this? What's the breakdown here? No one appreciates it. When I used to work back in the day in IT and I worked in help desk, I thought that kind of stuff all the time. Without me, this whole place shuts down. So it's relatable.
Yes.
It builds out the scene around him and everything.
Yeah, and that's precisely the point, is that from his point of view, he is what's holding the empire together.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's in a sense, you're giving the character their life. You're giving them where they are and where they place themselves in context of everything else around them. And it creates a juxtaposition for, the captain of the squads or the sergeant of the squads and one of the soldiers, and the roles that the way they see themselves and where they position themselves within the empire is going to be very different from this guy who's just delivering beer and ale everywhere.
Yeah.
So, and that to me, that sort of helps the world building process, because you're now peopling the culture with a whole variety of characters rather than one particular set of characters.
So just a question there too, in the context of Butt Crow's affliction. The way Majory works in the Malazan world, is it hands-on healing?
If somebody is not talented enough, probably. Yeah.
The Daniel healer can keep their distance then, I guess.
Yeah, which is a great incentive to, you know, become very good at what you're doing. But, you know, I mean, this kind of stuff, this is minor stuff. So, I mean, there's going to be, you know, creams, whatever, unguents, whatever you want to call them, right? There's going to be more mundane means of treating these things. But if the guy's activity makes him chronic, there's not much you can do. It doesn't matter if you have a, you know, high denul healer. It's not going to matter. 2 weeks later, he's going to have them again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Philip, you would know. You can't sit for very long.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out.
Well, sitting's horrible.
Yeah, it's bad for you, everyone. Sitting
It
is
is.
really bad.
I
Yeah.
have bad back problems if I sit too much. Yeah.
Yeah.
To that question, Alistair Reynolds. I just finished Alistair Reynolds. Which book did I just finish? Hold on a second.
Oh,
Is it a version?
And for those listening, the question was, have you read anything by Alistair Reynolds? Revelation Space reminds me of Malazan in terms of vast scope and having no single protagonist.
Hmm.
Ooh, inhibitor phase.
Yeah, just finished that one a couple days ago.
Hmm.
Yeah, he's a good writer.
That's cool.
I'm adding it to my TBR right now. I do need to thank you for recommending the Culture series. I finally read one. I read The Player of Games by
Oh wow.
Ian Banks, and I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, they are.
So good.
Yeah, they're great.
I remember you talking about like post scarcity and like what does that look like? We were walking back from dinner, I think, and you know, just that thought experiment alone is interesting. And then Banks really takes it and dives in. Yeah. And then obviously in Player Games, it's not a spoiler to say it, you know, he goes to a different empire who is very barbaric. Kind of sounds very similar to how things that we do today, and talks about like owning stuff, and the sense of owning something in a post-scarcity society means absolutely nothing, but in an older style society means everything. And that's just one of the very, you know, many examples. But yeah, I thought that it was one of the best science fiction books I've ever read. I really do.
Yeah, he's fabulous. It's fabulous. I would recommend Alistair Reynolds and Peter Hamilton as well. They write in sort of the same grand sort of visions in terms of the universe they create. It's good stuff.
Let's check it out. Peter Hamilton.
And Stephen, was there a book from your childhood or your early years that really had an impact on you that kind of set you on the path to start writing?
Book that set me on the path to writing. Yeah, I can't. I mean, if I think back to when I'm 12 and 13, and I'm reading Burroughs and Howard and people like that. But I was not thinking I was ever going to be a writer at that point. That didn't really kick in until my 20s, I would say.
Wow.
So now I'm trying to think back, what was I reading in my 20s that got me going? I would have to say Donaldson's Lord Fowl's Bane is the one that really, made me ambitious in the sense of what I was seeing that he was exploring there. And I guess for me, it coincided with my sense of growing out of my adolescence, and it seemed that one novel took a lot of epic fantasy and pulled it out of its adolescence into adulthood. And so the timing was, I guess, propitious in that respect.
So it's fair to say that the Thomas Covenant books, you looked at those and said, I think you can do some pretty cool stuff with this genre. Is that kind of
Yeah, but also just the style in which it's written, the voice in which it's written. It's so I pulled out a dictionary, when I was reading those books, because there's a lot of Latinate stuff going on there that I found really fascinating. And but yeah, it just felt yeah, it's adult themes. It's right from the start, right from the get-go, and very evocative. To present as your protagonist, not only somebody who's suffering from leprosy, but who is also emotionally traumatized and shut down. And then he is, just as the reader, he's thrust into a world of the fantastic. And the question is, does he accept the reality of it, or does he reject it out of hand as simply fantasy? And so those kind of questions, those are meta questions, and yet they're part of the story and they're tied in with the character. And I thought, wow, this is heady stuff. This is very, very well thought out, very interesting.
I did have a question from Paul. Has Steve read any?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. I've read some. Yeah, and I think I've met him actually. Pretty sure he came to ICFA one time. AP, you can verify that or not.
If he hasn't fallen asleep yet.
Yeah. I've read early Neil Stevenson, not his later stuff. In fact, is there one called Fall? The Fall? Is that his latest? Is that a big one of his? Let me know, Severin.
I think so.
Yeah?
I think. I might be wrong, though.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I started it. I've got it in hardcover. But I got. This is going to sound weird. It's a science fiction novel, I'm sure. Let me go check.
Yeah, Fall or Dodge in Hell. I think that's what it's called. Just hearing Thomas Covenant and that perspective makes me want to read it again.
Yeah. Well, I
I've
think
never read Thomas Covenant.
Yeah. I think one thing that's clear is that Stephen Donaldson is a writer who approaches his stories from the perspective of theme, and is very aware. I think I would guess. I mean, I haven't asked him, but I would guess that he's very aware of what he wants to accomplish with that story, and probably begins with a premise of a sort, wanting to work on a particular theme. So yeah, I mean, I would guess that he built his story around that first, but I don't know what you would say to that, Mr. Erikson.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was a conscious, and he's described this as a dialogue established with Tolkien. But having met him, and getting some of his own personal backstory, that ties in very deeply into what the trilogy is about. So that sort of added a whole new layer on things. And mind you, I didn't meet him until after Gardens of the Moon came out. So that was long after the first two trilogies. Yeah, I have Fall. I don't think I read it yet. It's got dust on it, so I don't think I've read it yet.
And in regard to Stephen Donaldson too, he's written essays which are really fantastic, which I think we're all here aware of, but that really should be read more, honestly. Where he kind of declares, this is what I'm trying to do with fantasy, when he calls it the literature of reintegration, right? So, and he brings up the Malazan Book of the Fallen as what he's talking about. So, yeah.
Do you think that most fantasy succeeds in that, or do you think just select types of fantasy succeed in that?
Succeeds in terms of reintegration? I think so, but I think the way Donaldson describes reintegration, he describes it in a positive aspect, a rewarding aspect, a fulfilling aspect. I think it may be the case that with some of the more modern Grimdark, the reintegration is actually almost more depressing by its nature, because it's inviting almost to embrace the nihilistic fictional world and then carry that back into our world. And that sounds pretty grim in its own right.
That sounds kind of similar to what Jenny Wirtz was saying in your live show last week, Steve, right? About how if you end with hopelessness,
Mm-hmm.
That's not where you really want your story to end. Ideally.
Yeah, I'm on the same page as Janny with that one. Absolutely.
That is a really interesting thing to hear, because I just finished R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse. I read the sequel, Quartet, and I definitely was left in a pit of hopelessness at the end of the Aspect Emperor. It did make me think a lot. And actually, it brought up something that we had discussed and whenever you came on Chatting with Nuts, and you recommended the Julian Jaynes book, I believe, by Cameron Ryan.
Yeah.
Yeah, he kind of plays with that in the second
does.
series. And I thought it was really fascinating. And like, I was able to identify, because you mentioned it. I have the book, and then I watched some videos on it, and I plan to read it this year. But as I'm reading through it, I'm like, wait, is that what this is? Like, is this something that's being played with here? And it just brought me back to when we discussed it. And then that trips you out, and then the bleakness of it and everything. I had never really thought about that, though, like being left with hopelessness and taking that back with you into the. I never thought of that.
Yeah, into our world. I mean, that's the thing with stories, is that you do take something back. You know, when you close the book, you're left with something, and then it's down to you, I guess, to decide. Is that something you want to wear, or is that something you want to discard?
Yeah, that kind of relates to a question I had for Philip, because Philip, you've been saying a lot on your channel recently, you are what you read. And I was wondering if you could expand upon that. And I think it's perfect to expand upon that in the presence of Steven Erikson, because obviously you just reread the series, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, as well as all the other Malazan books.
Yeah.
And I think, would you say that has something to do with your thoughts on that? You are what you read. And yeah, just if you could expand upon that.
Wow. Okay, I'll try.
Sorry.
Pressure's on.
My mind.
Feel free, any of you, to interrupt me or contribute. But yeah, I that's sort of a catchy phrase, I guess, that I use with my guests on Dear Dr. Fantasy, to get across the notion that all the stories that we've encountered, that we have listened to, that we've read, and they become part of us in some way or other. That we walk around with these stories in our minds, and they nudge us in certain directions. I think I believe that, and it's not that you're going to be completely transformed. I'm not going to be able to access Warrens after reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen, alas. But sorry, Jimmy.
Jeez, news to me.
Yeah, what a ripoff, right? Yeah. but I really do believe that we become influenced by the stories that we engage with. And if I'm using the Malazan Book of the Fallen as an example, and I'm talking right in front of the author, so it's a little nerve-wracking, but I don't mind at all, because it's something that I'm very, very open about, the fact that I believe that that's a series where, for me, we were just talking a moment ago about the idea of reintegration and Stephen Donaldson's concept. And for me, it is a series where I feel that there are so many. I figured out, too, that this is where, Mr. Erikson, this is where you make me cry a lot. It's actually in the moments of characters reuniting or connecting. And those are the ones that really get me. And I think that there's this sort of running thing in the series, because it happens a lot, where characters are brought together, where they experience this incredible connection with each other. And that is something that I carry with me in my life, because I do believe that empathy and compassion are very important, and that I want to be a compassionate person. And so I do think it has an effect when you engage with stories that emphasize such things. It has an effect on you in the way that you engage with other people. So, but yeah, I really do think that we are influenced by. So it's important to select stories that we feel like that will nudge us in the directions we want to be nudged into, I suppose, but also to be challenged and other things too. But yeah, so I don't know if I just gave you a very jumbled answer there.
And I'm so sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh
with
no,
that
that's
question,
okay.
but
He needs it.
You beautifully answered the question.
It's
It's
good for
something
me.
that I honestly have been thinking about ever since hearing you bring that up, because
Yeah.
I think I actually have been thinking about it before that too, because last year I spent, especially the second half of the year, just really concentrating on finishing the 10-book series. And that took over the majority of my reading life. Like all I read in December was The Crippled God. And unlike some people like Jimmy, it takes me forever to read a book. So so it took me a long time, but it also, I think, gave me a lot of time to process what I was reading too. So maybe there's some benefit there. But after finishing the series, it was interesting because when I got to the halfway point, I had finished my reread of The Lord of the Rings, and I was kind of where you were, Philip, and I was thinking, wow, The Lord of the Rings, this is the most amazing, beautiful experience ever. How can any series top this? And then by the time I got to the end of The Crippled God, I just felt like I was soaring. And I think that part of that too had to be the fact that I felt like I lived in your series for so long. I felt like I lived in it for a good part of the year, where my consciousness was constantly on the page. And so to come out of that, and every time I even closed a Malazan book, I felt like I'm coming out of a cave or something. There's no way that couldn't not change me or affect my consciousness in some way. And I think it did, in the sense that I mentioned this recently, that I've read a few more nonfiction books this year than I have in recent years. And every nonfiction book I've read this year, I thought, this reminds me of Malazan, or this reminds me of Malazan. And I was just seeing how so many themes kind of tied into my real life. And for me, I know that I have not read the Thomas Covenant series yet. I do want to. But I don't think that there are very many fantasy series that I can say have affected me on that level, where I feel like, oh, I feel this in my real life, like everywhere I look. So I just think that says something special about the Malazan Book of the Fallen and my experience with it, but also probably says something about the rewards of taking on something of that scope and that length. And I know, Jimmy, you've been reading a lot of Baker this year, so I'm sure you're having some experiences with that too, just taking in a larger series and these large ideas in a deep way. You too, Steve. I know you're into that series as well. But so either one of you, if you want to speak to that as well.
Well, so I mean, I'm a pretty depressed person in general. So like, there are pieces of it that like I'm like, yeah, man, the world sucks. But I mean, to be honest, Philip, you're saying you are what you read, but I find myself arguing with Baker at times on the page.
Good.
And for me, that's actually very rewarding. Like, I think that dialogue that's there, first off, I think it kind of speaks to the fact that there's like depth to the work, that I can sit there and have those arguments without him in the room. But at the same time, it just feels like you need that. Like, you need to read something that doesn't necessarily agree with you. And honestly, I would have considered myself pretty nihilistic at one point. And now I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure now, because I'm seeing some of these ideas come to pass. And it is fascinating, and I do think that it's very well done. But I guess I totally agree with what you're saying, but I also think it's really important to read the other side of that and stuff that you really disagree with. Wheel of Time is another series I very much disagree with on a lot of the things that come across, whether it's the execution or the actual point of it. It doesn't really matter. But I think like that's the other side of the coin, right? That's very, very important. But I read Realm of the Elderlings and Malazan back to back. And talk about two series that went home with me. I learned a lot about processing guilt and grief through Realm of the Elderlings. Robin Hobb like touched my soul in a way that not a lot of other authors can do. And then going into that, Johanna, you're kind of like, yeah, like you said with Lord of the Rings, like nothing can ever affect me like this. And Malazan did. And I found that the most powerful moments were, and this is the stuff that I took away, is the passion, compassion, and empathy. We always talk about that, but there's also forgiveness.
Yeah.
And this is a very odd kind of related topic, but like, have you guys ever watched someone in a court setting, like a real video, and someone has been murdered, like a son, and the father or mother forgives the person? It is the most powerful thing you will ever see in your entire, I don't care who you are. Like, it moves me, even just saying it now, thinking about, and like, it felt that heavy for me at points when the compassion was shown. So yeah, it becomes kind of like, you know, people say, oh, passion, empathy, we got it. But like, to experience it and to feel it, there's like a power behind that, and a vulnerability that I wanted to take away from the text and carry with me and apply it in my life. Which is one of the main examples I reach for whenever people say, well, like, oh, you read fiction, you don't get anything from fiction, especially fantasy. Like, that's one of the first things I reach for. So I think that, did I say the right? I can't remember.
Beautifully said. Yeah.
Beautifully said, Jimmy. Yeah.
And I would say that even in Mola's Book of the Fallen, there were even parts that got me to look at parts of myself that I did not feel comfortable with, that I was facing. And so there's that side of it too. But I love what you said, Jimmy, that you found yourself kind of even arguing with parts of Baker's writing or some of the hopelessness, because I think that's something, well, I know that AP, who's in the chat, I think still, AP and Philip often talk about the binary bias that's explored in Mola's Book of the Fallen. Just how, because you believe in one side of things doesn't make the other right, or, you know, we're looking at binary bias in so many different ways in the series, or even questioning what virtue is in so many different ways too. And geez, I forgot what I was going to say about that. But yeah, I think that I forgot what I was
talking about. The binary
bias. Yeah. Trying to think of where I was going to go with that.
It's okay.
Well, we could go back to it, but I am curious to ask Mr. Erikson if you have us all. Oh, it looks like, Johanna, you thought of it.
I was on the edge of it. Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to it.
No, come back to me. I'll get there.
I am curious to ask Mr. Erikson. So we're talking here about what an impact your series has had on us and how we believe that it's changed us as human beings. Do you ever wake up in the middle of the night and say to yourself, "Oh my God, I'm responsible for changing all these people," or anything like that? Or do you feel any responsibility as an author to write books that, I guess, nudge people in certain directions, or are you more interested in exploring, or what's your take on that?
I don't know if I'm not nudging in ideological sense. At least I certainly try not to. But you may end up as a reader nudged into a place where you're thinking about something that you may not have thought of before. Or you're seeing something that you thought, in terms of your own judgment on that particular thing, everything was settled. And then you're seeing it from an angle or a perspective that shakes that up a little bit.
That's it.
But I think this is more part of the actual creative process, at least for myself. If I sense something that is personally uncomfortable, or something that I'm undecided on, that's like a lodestone to me as a writer. I go straight for it. And so I have to, the writing is taking me through the process. And my hope is that, in a way, my exploration of that, whatever particular scene, theme, or whatever, is kind of like guiding the reader to accompany me in a safe fashion, because this is all fiction. It's all removed, once removed or twice removed. And then arriving at the place and releasing the reader's hand to decide what they're going to take from that. And I think, thinking back on it, Philip, when you were mentioning reunion aspects that you
Yeah.
read in the series. I got that from Donaldson as well. You know, there are whole elements of those stories where the major characters, the two main characters, Lyndon and Covenant, are divided, are separated, and Donaldson does a lot of splitting the two apart, and then bringing them back together. And in a sense, what he's doing in the fictional world, he's inviting for the reader, right? That idea of reintegration right there on the page.
Yeah.
You know, two strong thematic threads or two storylines. And then those storylines pick up the baggage of the experience of what they've gone through. And then when they come together, there's almost a synthesis that's occurring on the page. And then it's tied to the alternates points of view. You'll get it from Lyndon's point of view, and then you get it from Covenant's point of view. But as the series progresses, Covenant becomes less of a point of view, because he is in a sense ascending as he goes, whereas Lyndon is the character that is grounded, and we stay with a lot. So we're actually seeing on the page the benefits and the experience of integration within the story itself, as AP would say, within the diegesis. It's right sitting right there. Yeah. And I think I took that with me in writing the Malazan stuff, which is why you get that kind of unification stuff occurring to put reintegration on the page right in front of you. But it's not just in those instances of groups or people coming together having been apart for a long time. It is also, for me, themes and ideas that may appear to be very, very distinct and separate from each other, and then integrating them, or attempting to, by virtue of, you know, how the story is built and how the plot converges towards the end of the story.
Yeah, actually, that kind of that does relate to where I was trying to go with what I was trying to say earlier. And I'll just kind of backtrack by going a little personal here. Before reading the series a few years ago, I guess several years ago now, I went through a really difficult time in my life, as we all go through difficult times at times. And it was it was a time when I went really, really deep into introspection, into meditation, and faced a lot of uncomfortable things about myself in a way that I had never done before. And during that time, what I started to uncover was that so many things that I wanted to believe about myself. I'm a good person. I'm an altruistic person. I care about people. I'm an empathetic person. I could see the opposite of too. I could see places where I was also selfish, where I was also unkind or hard, you know, all the opposites of what I wanted to be. And at the same time, because I was giving myself space to see and witness all those things, it was a sort of safe space to be with those qualities and to open to them and to explore them, and in that way integrate, I guess, with them. And reading the series brought back so much of that for me. And I guess that's where I was going with the binary bias, is I felt like, oh wow, this is like just like exploring all those qualities. It's so easy to have empathy for people who are vulnerable or for people who display empathy, but it's so much harder to display empathy for people who are seemingly unempathetic. And I felt like that the series really got me to face some things like that, some difficult things, some difficult places, I think, in humanity where it's challenging to look at. But like you said, it created also a gateway, a safe space to explore these things and sort of land, or not land, I guess, but sort of suspend in the openness and hope for it too.
Wow, that's beautifully said, Johanna.
Thanks. I got there eventually.
Yeah, it was worth the wait.
Definitely. Our friend P.L. Stewart had a question. If you can disclose, with such an expansive universe, options for Malazan books seem endless. Will we see any standalones focused on Malazan characters as opposed to series?
No, not for me. There are two more Bokalane and Cobra Brooch novellas I'm under contract for, and that will fill that space. But no, that the question actually points to the opposite of the intention of the series. It's never about one person.
Mhm.
So why would I focus on one person? But going back to what Johanna said, what you described there, in a sense of via meditation and introspection, discovering sort of the flip side of the virtues, the flaws within oneself. That is an integrating process in and of itself, isn't it? And it's from that wisdom arises, when you recognize that it's not only is it a self-generated story about your own infallibility that we often operate under, but once that becomes dismantled, what you put back together again is much more rounded, much more humble, and much more solid in its own way, because it's a self-recognition of the good and the bad and the good, and how these two are actually closely intertwined. And so for me, that's an integrating process right there. And in the fiction, I think that's being played out all over the place, and certainly in the Malazan stuff. I'm conscious of that kind of thing, and not for the simple purpose of sort of rounding out characters or rounding out the reader's sensibilities regarding those characters. It's more a case of, you have to get to that point, like the point you've reached now, Johanna, in your life, where the first question is, having seen all of these other instances of judgment laid upon other people, the courtroom of the parent and you're witnessing the forgiving, is that from that point on, it begins with recognizing that you can forgive others, but then you actually have to go back and forgive yourself. And once that happens, then everything else actually gets a lot easier, and from every other side. That was my life experience in writing the Malazan stuff. By venturing into characters who were in a bad place, whether through their own actions or through external forces acting upon them. Eventually, for each of them, I had to reach a point of forgiveness for their actions. And I tried really hard to sort of hint at that all the way through, in terms of some very, very despicable characters. And some, in a sense, I could not reconcile, like Bidethal, for example. So because I could not reconcile and could not forgive, Karsa steps in for me and does the deed.
Oh dear!
So it's
Takes the matters in hand.
Yeah, literally. Yeah, and those are my limits. Those are my limitations of how far I can go in terms of forgiveness. But it's an exercise in pushing those limits, to write characters like that, and to describe horrendous scenes as well.
Yeah, it sounds like a really like a true living relationship between you and the character. Because like earlier you said, like the character grows, and then also you as the author of that character is growing. It's really amazing.
Well, and I kind of like that you said that too about Karsa taking that matter on, because it's authentic to where you are in that moment.
Yeah.
Just recognizing where you're at with not being able to forgive.
Yeah, there's no way I could write myself out of the judgment I laid upon Bidethal for his actions. I couldn't do it. And so he was a stand-in for the argument on cultural relativism, moral relativism, relating to cultural traditional practices throughout our world. And it's one of those issues where I simply cannot, in good conscience, I actually cannot place myself in a position where I can suspend or withhold judgment on that.
Yeah.
If that's my failing, then so be it. But you know, I did my best with Bidithal, so couldn't do it.
Another aspect of that I think you explore a lot in the series is the idea of redemption. And you know, how does one redeem oneself? Are there acts for which you cannot be redeemed? You know, and I don't think you ever say, you know, here's the answer to this question. It's more putting it out there for us to really have to ponder. And
Covian became the extreme response to that.
Yeah.
But I would argue that his response is actually deeply flawed. And that's what I explored in Toll the Hounds for sure.
Yeah.
I know it's quoted quite often, you know, when he talks about forgiveness. I think it's forgiveness, or is it redemption? I can't remember. Anyways, it's a quote that's used, that's taken out a lot from his commentary.
Well, there's also absolution and redemption, and that's another thing you explore in Toll the Hounds a lot.
Yeah, and in that way, because I knew,
and there's AP saying the same thing.
I was returning to Darujistan, so that's the opportunity to then revisit the earlier themes of the series.
Yeah.
Do Unicorns Read had a question. How do you deal with the emotional fallout of writing those at times challenging scenes?
Yeah.
Well, the process of writing for me is it doesn't quite purge it, but it gets me to a place where the dust can settle and you know, the wounds can close and the scabs can form and all the rest. And that, to me, that was the purpose of writing it in the first place, is to get to that place. And the hope is always that the reader can come to that place as well. Knowing that that's not always the case. You know, some things are, for personal reasons, just one step too far, and that's fair enough. Right?
Yeah.
It strikes me too how much self-exploration a writer must do, especially when writing the sort of thing that you're doing, and even I think sometimes when you're creating characters, you're exploring little facets of yourself in some way. And then this very personal exploration gets put out in the world, and so many other people engage with it and have their own personal baggage experiences that they bring to these zines as well. So it's really interesting how the personal becomes this dialogue with all kinds of people.
Yeah, it is a dialogue. It's always, I mean, I remember sort of in the writing programs, fellow young writers showing up and saying they only write for themselves. And in my head, I would quietly, well, I would never say it out loud, but basically my response was something along the lines of, if you write for yourself, what are you doing in a workshop? And why are you showing anybody your work? Just stick it up on a shelf and go on to the next one. Because it struck me as, well, it's diffident. There's a self-defense mechanism involved there. And as young writers, you know, in a program like that, you are very vulnerable, and and you feel it every moment, especially in workshops. So there is a natural tendency to raise up sort of rationalizations that make the opinions and judgments of others immune, make you immune to those things. Because you got to toughen your skin up, and but it's fundamentally, it's not true. I mean, writing is communication, and so if there's a communication, there is a presumed audience, and if there's a presumed audience, then, you know, as in any conversation, there is a level of responsibility adhering to both people in that conversation. And so that, to me, is something I always wanted to be really conscious of, that I have a responsibility to the reader who's going to follow me on this journey. And one of the ways I try to play that out was, you know, if you're going to stay with me for 800 pages or 1,000 pages, I will do my best to deliver the payoff at the end of the book.
You do that quite well.
Yeah, and for the series as well. I mean, if you're going to stay with me for, you know, 3.5 million words, yeah, I'll do what I can. Yeah, thanks, AP. I saw the quote, the in abundance one. Yeah.
Oh, compassion is priceless. In the truest sense of the word, it must be given freely in abundance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a problematic statement. I would actually suggest that that's not the case. But, it's a thing to be explored and thought about. So he was the extreme, basically saying, there's redemption or whatever sits outside of the human context of morality and ethics. And I would argue that's probably not the case, but he argues the extreme. So.
Had a question from No Disclaimer. Wanted to know your overall thoughts on the discourse surrounding Grimdark as a subgenre and its seemingly muddled classification we tend to circle around.
Well, it's very much almost a modern redefinition of Grimdark. You could look at Robert E. Howard as a very early example of Grimdark. And if you do, then read a biography about him as well, and you'll get the fuller context of his approach to his stories, and how his worldview and difficulties that he experienced in his real life were playing out in his fantasy settings. So, I mean, Grimdark's been around for a long time, just not called Grimdark. I really don't. I mean, I basically, I'm not reading fantasy these days, anyways. I wonder has anybody spoken of Grimdark with respect to science fiction? I don't think so. I'm not sure.
I've heard of a little bit.
To my mind, there's plenty of science fiction that would fall under the category of a fairly nihilistic, maybe even occasionally graphically overindulgent violence within a science fiction setting that, for me, would fall under the same category of the fantasy Grimdark we're looking at. I know Backer did a science fiction novel about
Neuropath.
Oh, that was one where I needed about 50 showers after that thing, because that was that was so grim, that was so dark in its outlook. It just clung to me, and not in a pleasant way. And so it's certainly not a book I'll ever reread. But yeah, he took it to places that one would recoil, I think, from. So one could arguably call that Grimdark, but it's science fiction. So I don't know if I guess if it's self-identified by the author as they're writing Grimdark, then they have an idea of what they mean by that, and that's because that's what they're writing. I don't know. I don't really have much more to say on that. I think I talked about it many years ago. My disquiet with it, in its celebration of maybe the poorer qualities of our species.
Shelley had a question. Have you ever written a character you realize that you hate him or her?
No. It doesn't matter how despicable they are. With a few caveats. I mean, in a sense, I had, for example, Bidethal. I pushed him into that role for the purposes of exploring that particular aspect of the story, but recognizing that he was as much a product of his environment as the victims that he and made into victims. And in that instance, like as I mentioned earlier, I could not reconcile the two. So he suffered a grim fate, a grisly fate. And there are other characters for whom that happens. Although quite often, well, actually every time, the final decision, the final judgment and punishment is visited by other characters, and it should make sense within their context.
What about that Apto Cannibalian? Slippery.
I mean,
Yeah.
I've tried to kill him in multiple novellas, and he just squeezes through somehow. He gets through the bars. I don't know. He's bound to show up again at least once in one of these last two Corporal Broach and Locally novellas.
Good. I hope to see his slithering days end.
Do you know about him, Steve?
I don't.
Do I know about who?
Steve,
Steve.
page chewing Steve.
Right, not Erikson. Gotcha.
That's not Erikson. Yeah, that's the character that Steven Erikson wrote based on AP Canavan, Critical Journal.
It's not based on. It is AP Canavan.
Oh, okay. It is AP Canavan. Sorry. I haven't read the story yet, but it's on my shelf. I need to read it.
Well, that one, yeah, that's a bit of a polarizing little novella. That one.
Is that the one in Worms of Weirmouth? Is that the right name? Something like that?
It's Crackpot Trail.
Oh, Crackpot Trail. Okay. I think I have it. Yeah, I think it's on my shelf.
It'll be in if you have volumes 1 and 2. It'll be in there.
Volume
Second
1.
volume.
Buckling and Corbel Bridge.
Yeah.
The entire time I read Crackpot Trail, I was hearing and seeing AP. So, I mean, it's like a biography almost.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I have a question, and I would love to hear your take on it. Calling you Erikson feels weird, but I would love to hear your take on it. I ask almost every guest now this question because I'm kind of fascinated by it in a lot of ways, and there's a reason for that I can explain after. But do you believe that there are people who are great writers that maybe aren't the best storytellers and storytellers that aren't the best writers, or do they have to be coupled? Like, what's your take on that?
There are many great storytellers who don't write. Right?
Yeah.
You can sit in a bar and listen to somebody who tells a fantastic story. So I think they are very distinct things. One of the things with the writing process is that until you are fully comfortable and immersed in the craft of writing, your writing process may actually be an impediment to your good storytelling abilities. And that's the thing that workshops can be really helpful on, because they teach you craft. They can't teach you what ideas to write about and what stories to come up with. That's not what they're there for. It's all about the craft. And so come out of that, and if you have a good handle on craft, that makes your storytelling abilities that much more easier to convey to other people through the written word as opposed to spoken.
I like that a lot. That's definitely the best answer I've had to that question.
So I have a question about that, kind of similar. I feel like, even though I don't have a degree in literature, but I feel like a lot of talk, I guess, general talk here on BookTube or whatever, and I'm probably guilty of it too. Sometimes I hear the criticism of theme being on the nose. And I wonder, do you think that that's indicative of poor writing when themes are very blatant in storytelling? Because I know that you've talked before, I think on Philip's channel, about your approach to themes kind of being like a burrow technique, I guess, the metaphor for that, or sort of buried under
the invisible rock.
Narrative.
Yeah, the invisible rock. I don't know if the theme is that important as a driving force to what the writer is creating. I have no issue with it being up front and center. I mean, one of my favorite series growing up on television was Star Trek, the original series. If you want your themes up front and center, you can't get more obvious than that. And the irony is, of course, the executives at NBC or whatever, right over their heads, right? But it's right there in front of you now. So sometimes one has to be really obvious.
Yeah.
So no, I have no hard and fast rule on that. If it's explored with integrity, then yeah, that's fine.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, I was curious about that. I was just listening to a lecture by the author R.F. Kuang, and she was talking about how her stance on theme is actually, she's arguing against the whole notion that theme has to be subtle or sort of hidden, and talks about, I guess, her approach being very different than that. And I think she's coming from a very specific place with that and has a good rationale. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of curious about that topic now.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at Iowa, you know, the writing program there, theme was a dirty word. It just wasn't
Oh,
mentioned.
wow.
So subtext was an even dirtier word. So
Yeah.
you know, there was a particular stylistic expectation within that program for that time. I'm sure it's changed now. Where these were simply not relevant, you know, not relevant to the process of writing fiction. And you know, I really was very much out of place when I was at Iowa. I didn't fit with that at all.
Maybe I could just try to play devil's advocate for a moment. And the idea that good storytelling is more persuasive when it's more subtle, I guess, where you don't, if you bludgeon the reader with the message, they're going to turn off their receptivity to it. Whereas if you're more subtle and you work it into the story in a way that's a bit deeper, but still present, not as obvious, then maybe you're actually going to be more effective in getting that across, or influencing, if that's your goal, people to see a certain thing. I don't know.
I think Peter Barry mentioned something about that in Beginning Theory. It's a book I read. AP recommended it to me a while back. I think he mentioned something like that, Philip. I'm trying to recall what it was.
I mean, it's pretty common advice, I think, and I'm not making it up. It's pretty common advice, I think, in writing. But I wondered what Mr. Erikson thought of that.
Can you sort of repeat it? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So the idea that if you bludgeon your reader with
all right, yeah, okay,
preaching versus more subtly weaving it into this, burying it underneath the story, and therefore more effectively, perhaps getting the reader to listen. No, okay, good.
no, it's the presumptions underlying that argument. Are where I take exception. For one, is it's assuming that the theme that you are delivering is intended to instruct, educate, or enlighten your reader. And so once you're in that position, you're no longer sharing a story with a reader. You are now taking on an instructive role, which presumes that you have more knowledge and are in a superior moral place than the reader. I don't buy either of those things. It's a different story when you're in a classroom and you have a professor who knows her field of interest and is instructing you. That's the right context for that notion of authority. When it comes to the human condition, the presumption that an author has greater authority over those issues than the reader is a huge one, and one I would not ascribe to at all.
And the word author is, of course, has, authority has the word author in it, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. But
that's a good point.
It's to me, it's much more, let's look at this, let's explore this particular theme. And themes are not simply, themes are generally aspects of the human condition, and that can be positive. They're neutral in a sense. They are simply parts of the human condition. And so there's no right or wrong. They simply are. And if the author approaches it from that perspective, then you don't find yourself in that superior mindset. In fact, it goes the opposite way. You're humbled by the more you explore those themes. because you discover just how complicated they are, how internally contradictory they can often be. And so to continue that argument that if you're presenting a theme in a very obvious fashion, versus slipping it in, you're actually talking there, I think, about authorial intent, because slipping it in is the same as being subversive. So you are subversively placing themes in your story to spring them on the reader subconsciously, or at the end of the book consciously, which is a very strange mindset to be in if as a writer, if this is the nature of your relationship with your reader, is to slip one over, or to deceive them in ways that are not plot related, which is, surprise plot. I mean, that's a cool thing. Everybody likes that. Right. But to actually deceive them in terms of their moral stance, on the basis of those particular themes, that sounds very, very dubious to me.
That's a very interesting response. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Of course, Apto Cannavale in the chat there is reminding you that there's no intent anyway because you're dead.
Yeah, that is true. It's funny how that is. I'm going to go off on a rant here. Are you guys ready for a rant?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, I've not seen any of Rings of Power. Okay.
I haven't either.
I'm certainly seeing a lot of attacks on the first 2 episodes, and most of them relate to the defense is, and which is kind of fatuous in this case, but let's just call it fidelity to text, fidelity to world building, if you will. And so the attacks are on the basis of actors who are people of color appearing in this fictional universe that Tolkien's created. And so what I'm sort of gathering is this is very strange. It could not happen, I don't think. Well, it has happened with Gaiman, but it could not happen if Tolkien were alive. That you would get this particular argument regarding fidelity to text. And I'll explain why in a second. But the fidelity to text can only operate if one dispenses with fidelity to the person or the author. In other words, because Tolkien's dead, he's not there to actually stand up and say, hold on a minute, stop gatekeeping, stop standing between me and this new potential audience, because we're in a more inclusive world right now. And this is an audience, as a writer, I would love to reach and have those people find something to identify with in my works. So that kind of gatekeeping really, really pisses me off, because it's fidelity to a text over, or rather creating infidelity to the person who actually created the text. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I know you're Canadian, but you're going to have to work on the emotional volume when you do a rant.
Well, I want to be very, very clear in what I'm saying here. People can
Yeah.
argue and complain about production quality, acting, script writing, all the rest. But if they start arguing about inclusivity in terms of casting, they are so far off base. And if Tolkien were alive today, and I have no other connection with Tolkien other than we're both writers, but I'm taking from a writer's point of view, he would say, what the fuck are you doing? And what are you talking about? I want to reach those people. This is the way to do it. If an author wants to reach the maximum number of people and actually engage and produce works where more people are actually able to identify with aspects of the story they are telling, that is the author's purpose. And that is their dream, is to have an audience of 6-7 billion, right?
Wow.
To reach out. So anybody who steps in front of that and says, no, those people they're not for you to reach, because you wrote about stuff back in the 30s and 40s, and it was an entirely different patriarchal white world at the time where you were writing, we're gonna hold this gate closed
Ah.
to all these other people. And the author would say, "Fuck you,"
Yeah.
get out of the way,
Yeah.
right? So
But at the very least, it's a massive disservice to the story as well. Then
it's
isn't
presumptuous, it's arrogant, it's extraordinary.
Do you feel like at times readers get more attached to lore and being, with the canon or whatever than the author like he or she does? Like,
Yeah, absolutely. And there's reasons for that. We don't know for each of these individuals how important those works were for their lives.
mm-hmm.
We don't know where they were at the time of the reading it. We don't know where they were developmentally, because quite often this is the case where it's adolescent readers who become attached to these things throughout their lives. And there's nothing intrinsically flawed or wrong with that. So that kind of loyalty it's not loyalty to the text. It's loyalty to the memory and the experience of reading that thing. That's the loyalty. And so when that gets, quote, challenged by any external forces, you get up in arms. But it's actually not relevant to the text at all, because the text has to be something that has built into it the capacity to evolve over time. Otherwise, it becomes a lost language. It becomes a lost text. And once you bear that in mind, then every generation that discovers that work is going to relate to it in a unique way and in a new way, potentially. And that's the gift of writing. That is what, these books and the bookstores you go into that have books that are 150 years old or whatever, that's what it's all about. It's about a new generation of readers coming to these old stories and making those stories, or finding or discovering that those stories have something fundamental to contribute to their growth as a human being.
Yeah, and human nature.
Yeah.
So, to speak true throughout ages.
Yeah, and so constantly drawing the line through time is pointless, right? The line, everything keeps moving. You can't draw the line. You can't build the wall. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
So why bother? Why try? Why not celebrate that next generation that's going to discover these works? And if you've created a series now that's inclusive, visually, and culturally, and so on, well, that next generation is going to be that much bigger.
Yeah.
Of people appreciating the work.
Yeah.
Why would you? It's basically because of that nostalgic tie to that personal experience to the work. It almost becomes the entire world in terms of defending. There are no other interpretations possible. There's only this one, and I can understand the context of it, and I can sympathize, but it's an inclusive world now, and for white middle-aged people like me of Northern European extraction, well, we got to suck it up. Stop whining, stop bitching, just suck it up.
Yeah.
And it's also an archaeological point of view, because this period of cultural domination that emerged out of Europe, it's a blip. It's a freaking blip. That's all it is. You look at the history of ancient Egypt, we're talking 3,000 years at least of continual cultural identification. Yeah. 3,000 years. They weren't white. They weren't European. So this momentary blip that is now, we're now ending. It's coming to an end. And those who benefited the most from it are kicking and screaming and holding on, tooth and claw to its dregs. But its time is done. It's done. And, we got to suck it up.
That's a thing that I really love about your series, along with Ian Esselmont's books too, where there's this viewpoint of human beings in a moment, and a perspective where you zoom out, and I've likened it to seeing one of those films in the American Museum of Natural History where you say, here's planet Earth, and then you just sort of zoom out, and then you get the sense of your own smallness in the context of something far more vast. And so often we live with this perspective that our present is everything, that everything has always been the way it is now, right? But no, when you experience, like you guys are so great at describing these layers of history and civilizations past, and you even screw around with poking fun at historians who think they can actually capture all of that. That's a perspective that I find very valuable, and something that is very conducive to fantasy as well. I think that this idea of these layers of the past and giving us the sense of our own place in this big universe. We're pretty tiny after all, you know.
Pale blue dot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's just brilliant the way you're also able to zoom in very closely with characters too, even just for brief moments. And I know I watched the wonderful discussion that you had with Professor Fireballs on psychic distance. And that was so illuminating for me as a reader. I mean, I know that's John Gardner, right? His concept of psychic distance, and there's multiple layers to that.
Many authors will talk about it, but yeah, psychic distance.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But it's something that I think about all the time now when I'm reading, is just how close I feel to characters when I'm reading about them, or how close or distant they feel to the world around them or to each other, and just ways that authors can play with that. I just think is fascinating.
Is that the one where they talked about serendipity, or a different one?
I think it was a different one.
Okay.
Yeah, but that one I loved. I think that serendipity. I'm trying to think. No, I think that was a different one, but I could be wrong.
Well, Iron Bars is in that scene too.
Yeah. I love all those talks. I just it's interesting because I'm not a writer of fiction, and I don't even really have any interest in being a fictional writer, but I just find the techniques fascinating, because it's fascinating to me to figure out how I'm having this psychological effect with what I'm reading.
Yeah, and just learning about these things, you can recognize it in the writing that, the books you're reading. You suddenly say, yeah, I know what's going on here. That's cool. Or that didn't work, and now you know why, right? So
yeah,
useful for readers as well, for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you would think that seeing those things would pull you out of the story, but it doesn't. For me, it sometimes deepens my experience. Like, for example, I know Jimmy was the one actually who got me to pick this up sooner than later, but I recently picked up this book called Stoner by John Williams. It's so good the whole time. And it's I guess it was written in 1965, and it's a literary fiction book. And the premise is about this university professor, and you follow his life from when he's a young boy, when he's living on a farm, to when he dies. And he lives this from a distance. If you look from the outside, it seems like he lives a very unremarkable life. Like he's somebody you would just see him passing. Oh, that's that professor. And you wouldn't think anything of him. And the way John Williams writes his story, I felt so intimate with this character and what he was going through. And at the same time, it's a historical fiction novel in the sense that it's taking place in, I think, Columbia University.
That's right. Yep.
During the 1930s and World War II, all of this happening in the background. But because of the character he's kind of a very stoic character. He feels very distanced from everything that's happening in the world around him, at the same time as you can feel how everything in the world around him is affecting the characters he's interacting with.
Yep.
And it just creates this incredible narrative experience. But yeah, all that came to life, and all I could think of the whole time was that psychic distance conversation you two had. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's so neat the way he's doing that.
So it's not set in the late 60s hippie commune?
No. It's not stoner because he's a stoner.
Yeah, I was disappointed in that fact, but after I got over that, it was a pretty good book. That book is the opposition to The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby, Gatsby's supposed to be kind of cool. Obviously, his end is not cool, but glitz and the glamour and the fame, and Stoner is the exact opposite. He is the mundane, undervalued, underappreciated professor in a marriage that isn't working. And there's a profound moment in that book, and I'll never forget it, because I think it's the first time I've ever wept in the gym. I was listening to audiobook while I stretch. So I'm stretching, doing my thing. And there's a moment where he basically graduates and he goes back. He's going to accept to be a professor. And he goes in and tells his parents, they're like, all right, now you're back. You can work on the farm. We're proud of you, but it's time to work on the farm. And it's not a big moment. He just says, I'm going back. I'm not staying here. And it's like this admission that what his parents had built for him and had expected for him and the path they took is not good enough for him. It is like this unspoken declaration that I will do better than this. And it crushed me, man. It crushed me.
Jimmy, I'm picturing you in the gym crying and all these big wrestler dudes coming to comfort you.
Bro, I'm telling you, I literally had tears like dropping off my face.
You have to read it, Philip. It's so good.
It's one of the most powerful things I've ever read.
Me too. It's not fantasy, but it's so good. Amazing. It is also, amazing.
His prose is phenomenal.
His prose is so good. My mom is a huge prose snob, by the way, and she listened to the audiobook too, and she was just stunned. She was just stunned by the prose.
Fun fact: when he released that book, the critics disparaged him for his prose.
Yeah, not surprised.
Yeah, they said he was too plain, very like just meh, too straightforward.
No way. My mom and I sat and talked about the subtext of this one part where he's looking out the window and he's looking at the snow and he's thinking about the purpose in life and just the way all that came together in this one simple scene. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's a boring book that has no right to be that great. I tell people it's probably gonna be boring, but I promise it's something to experience.
You read the first 2 paragraphs, and the first 2 paragraphs tell you everything that's going to happen in the book.
Yeah.
It's like this man named William Stoner. He was a university professor, and he died. It's very straightforward. This is a very simple, unremarkable, boring man. And then you read the story, and it just gets you on every level. It's amazing.
Yeah, cool. Beautiful book.
I have it on my shelf because of both of you.
Yay!
Yeah.
The audiobook is free on Audible.
Yeah, free on Audible.
And it's 6 hours. It's very short.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. I had a question from Daniel, or aka Dr. Puff and stuff. When was the last time a video production company had approached you to talk Malazan, and how did it go?
I can't comment on these things. Sorry.
Sorry.
I'll take that as good news.
Yeah,
yes.
This is good news. Yeah.
I can answer that question. It has never happened to me. No one has ever asked me to make Malazan into. So.
I think you signed an NDA, didn't you, Philip?
I know a lot of people talk, by the way, about wishing they could get more of the trade paperbacks of Malazan.
Yeah, can we make that happen? I know you can't do a thing about that either.
That's publishing.
That's got nothing to do with me, unfortunately.
I had to work so hard to get my trade paperback of Memories of Ice.
Yep.
I had a good connection. Otherwise, I would have probably not have that on my shelf.
Wow.
I'm still waiting on that sub press. They had some issues at the printers, and I'm like, guys, where are we at?
Yep.
It's been radio silence for 2 months, and I'm getting nervous.
Well, I mean, they have to return them all, so
it's a big task.
Yeah, these guys are perfectionists. They want to make sure that you get the right thing. So,
and man, that cover.
Yeah, no kidding.
So you have a few Malazan books left to write, right?
Yeah, 3 novels and 2 novellas.
How do you feel? Because the finish line is somewhere here, within reach. Do you feel a sense of relief at that? Do you feel a sense of dread, accomplishment? What is that like, saying the final chapter of Malazan?
I'll tell you when I get there. I don't know. I mean, right now, I don't know if this was the same with you guys, but when I was swimming competitively, I swam the mile, 1,500, and you set your targets, you know, the first 100 or the first 200 meters, and you only think about those 200 meters, and then you go to the next one, and you go to the next one, and eventually you close and you finish the race. That's how it is with this. I'm thinking primarily about No Life Forsaken, which is what I'm going to be wrapping up. It should be finished by spring. Once it goes off to the publisher, I turn immediately to Walk in Shadow, and I go through the slog of however long that's going to take. I'll do it because I know when I've delivered No Life Forsaken, it's going to be at least a year before it's going to be published, and it'll be at least 6 months before I see the copywritten manuscript. So that gives me some time to run through and finish Walk in Shadow. So you finish the thing in front of you and worry about the rest later.
Yeah, so it's a good way not to get overwhelmed.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah. And you can do that writing a novel as well. Your task is to finish the scene, stop, and then the next scene, and then the next, and then you've done that chapter. And your task is to write the next one. You know?
It works for students writing research papers too.
I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Works in coding as well. Take a big thing, someone says, build me this, and you say, okay, that's terrible. I gotta like break it down or I'm gonna have a panic attack. And you're like, okay, I'll just make a button. Let's make a button. And then you build up from there.
Self-centered Bryce has a question. While mouse members are the most hardcore, were you able to negative split? I hope you know what that means.
I think I know what that is. That's actually to
sounds painful.
Well, no, make your last 100 faster than the first, I think, but progressively. I don't remember. It's too long ago. No, I mean, back then, believe it or not, we didn't even have goggles. So you're in chlorinated water, and so your eyes are just, by the end of the mile, man, you're done. But I would run a song through my head. I think it was Sympathy for the Devil, which had the right pacing, the right beat, and put the song on repeat in my head during the race.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I used to be a hardcore runner, but I've never done it competitively with anybody else but myself.
Yeah, Josh, you're right about that. If you're a good runner, if you're an idiot like some people who run marathons, you go too fast in the first half and you run out of gas. So, yeah.
Do you listen to music when you write?
I used to. Now I listen to music if whatever the cafe soundtrack is deplorable. Then I put the headphones on.
What are your go-tos?
I tend to go to stuff with really good lyrics, which sounds weird, but I find them inspiring. And I really cannot write to instrumental pieces.
That's interesting.
Yeah, isn't it strange? Yeah, but I need good lyrics.
Can you give us examples?
Oh, well. Let's see, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Bruce Cockburn, Canadian guy. Some Pink Floyd occasionally.
Oh, it's my favorite band.
Oh, they're phenomenal.
Dark Side of the Moon.
I tend to sort of, let's just say it's flashback inducing. I'll just leave it at that. So who else? Oh, hang on a sec. I'm being called. Yeah? What is it, Claire?
It's funny because I would find that so distracting to listen to lyrics. I couldn't write because I'd be listening to the lyrics. So it would be like just sort of, it's almost like, it is weird. I'm sorry. It sounds so weird to me that you would that would work for you. But hey, whatever works. I think the product is pretty good. So yeah.
Can you give me 3 minutes? I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, take your time.
Yeah.
We'll
All right,
chat. We know how to do that.
Yeah.
There was a we were kind of talking about, like, I first off, I love the Rings of Power discussion. Like, I think that was excellent. And one of the things that I was thinking about is a lot of people were mad that Corlys Velaryon, and by a lot I mean not that many, were mad that Corlys Velaryon was black in House of the Dragon, because the Velaryons supposed to be from Valeria, which are like cousins to the target, all this stuff, right? And George has been asked about this. He's also been asked about some of the lore changes in the show, and he did an interview with History of Westeros. And he has this big thing he's talking about, and he goes, see, the thing about lore is it's not real. And I was like, and he's like, I'm not trying to hate on the fans, but it's not real. And I just like had this moment where I was like, oh yeah, it's not real. And like, that's how authors look at this. Like, they're like, you know, some people say, you know, you get super attached to characters, but I've heard like the likes of like Joe Abercrombie be like, well, no, like they're part of the story. Like, they're a piece to move the story along, and like they're a device, right? Like, or they're a tool. And sometimes I think as fans, we have to like back up just a little bit. Like,
Interesting.
you know what I mean? Like, and I get it. Hey, I can get tribal. Okay. If I need to, I can get pretty tribal. I can get a little gatekeepy with the lore. I get it. But I think as readers, sometimes we got to back off just a little bit. Just gotta back off.
Jimmy, I'm not really listening to the noise, but is House of the Dragon then getting the same kind of
No.
not as much as Rings of Power?
No, for the most part, I would say the overwhelming majority are finding it to be really quality. So it has shushed a lot of that because it's just good. Like, it's just like there's more other stuff to talk about now. Also, the guy playing Corlys is killing it. Like, killing it. He's doing such a good job, which we knew he would. And again, it's a bunch of idiots, if I'm being completely frank. Like, I just think it's a bunch of morons. And it was just amazing to hear George say that. And he was talking more like also about some of the lore changes, because we were like book show, you know, or book canon, show canon. And he's just like, it's not real. It's not real. It's fine, guys. Like, I promise it's going to be okay. And
that's exactly what Steven Erikson was talking about. You know, for the fans are more up in arms, and the authors, it's like, yeah, it's all made up, guys. You know.
Yeah. You know, it's and by the way, Jimmy, I know you said in your wrap up that you were thinking of getting away from doing the book to show comparisons. And I was going to let you know, I haven't watched your videos on that yet, but I actually have intended to. I just, but if I do watch the show, yours is the one I want to watch, because I know you're going to talk about the book to show comparisons, and I'm curious, though I haven't read the book yet. Fire and Blood.
You could probably watch it, honestly. Like, spoiling Fire and Blood, it's like for instance, the first episode's covered about like 2 paragraphs. Like, that's how little context there is, which actually makes as an adaptation very interesting, right? To fill that dead space. Really, really interesting. I like what AP said in the chat. He said, we spend hundreds of hours with our favorite worlds and books. And I think that is where, right? Like, I bet some people hear that, you know, Steve can't remember, like, if someone was alive at the end of House of Chains, and they're like, what do you mean you can't remember? You're the author. And it's like, yeah, dude, like, I wrote it. You know what I mean?
Wait, what you were saying about characters being kind of narrative devices, I just recently finished reading the 3rd Dune book, Children of Dune, and I kind of, it was so good. I loved it. Like, I can understand why some people wouldn't be as into those later books, I guess. But I loved it. And the thing is, the characters, they feel, I guess how you would describe them, flat, Philip. They feel like each one represents more of a philosophy and a culture than they do kind of like an individual person that you would know or something. But for me, I loved it. I loved that exploration and those conversations that they evoked.
Yeah, flat characters serve a purpose. It's not, if people hear the word flat and they think bad, but actually flat characters can be very important. I mean, they're all over, like, you know, Charles Dickens has tons of flat characters. They're stereotypes. They're one-dimensional, but they're vivid because in that one characteristic is just so well done. So you can do flat characters really well, and they can serve a really important purpose. Often they're symbolic, like you say.
Yes. Actually, it's interesting because there's a character, I can't say who it is because of spoilers, but there's a character, I'm talking about the 3rd Dune book, Children of Dune, Steven Erikson, but there was a character in there that I was thinking about when I finished, and I thought, this person's journey really reminds me of Fellison in Dead House Gates. Like there are so many parallels, but just done in a very different way. Because obviously it's a very different approach to characterization. But I just find it interesting just the way that can be explored in sort of like a different characterization approach. Though I'm not like the expert on talking about those techniques, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think to AP's point about us spending a lot of time with our books, and I think some, especially when we're younger, those memories like we talked about earlier, I think that leads to some of that gatekeeping. Is we feel like we have ownership somehow of certain stories or characters or worlds.
Well, I mean, you own the experience, your personal experience.
Yeah.
But actually, that really is as far as it goes.
Yeah, that's why I get, some of the the superhero movies, and some people say, well, that's not my fill in the character here. That's not my Captain America. That's not my Batman. That's whatever. It's like it's not your character. It's just an interpretation. It's just a version of it. Just be happy. And with all the new fantasy, the series that are being made, it's like we should all celebrate them, even if we don't enjoy them. The better they do, the more likely it is for other series to be made. So
exactly.
just let people enjoy what they're going to enjoy, and
absolutely.
Yeah. I think a lot of this criticism is really fantasy fans shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah.
It's frustrating in that respect.
With a bow, I guess, right?
No, I guess, yeah.
There's also like the phenomenon that's going on with Marvel, where they're coming up with so much Marvel content that I see people kind of repelling against it, and they're like, well, I don't want any more. Like, I wish they'd stop making it. And like, I understand that there could be like criticisms of how it's being done, if they feel like they're just tossing things out just to make money. I get that. Like, there's a greed aspect from a corporation, but I also think it's wild because like I'm old enough to remember, like, I never thought I would see another like Superman movie or another Batman movie. And you watch the older ones, you're just like, wow, that's crazy. Like, they may never do that again. To now where it's like, I wish they'd stop making those movies. And I'm just like, that's wild. Like, we are so spoiled in a way. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, to be honest, but because, Disney and everything else. But yeah, I don't know. It's a weird time. It's a very strange time. And it's almost like the thing now is to be negative about something so hard out of the gate. Like, you have to be, just dumpster it. You see a teaser, dumpster it. You got to make sure that you're cool enough that if it's bad, you're like, I told you so. It's like, very strange.
And I feel so bad, but I find myself kind of avoiding all of it because of that. Like,
it's exhausting.
I just don't want to even, engage at all.
I feel that way about Rings of Power. I feel that way about Rings. It was so exhausting because, we're all tuned in, we're plugged in. We see comments all the time on our channels and whatnot. And really made me like reevaluate to like, what level do I want to engage online about certain topics? Because when I sat down to watch Rings of Power, as soon as I hit play, I was tired. I was just tired of the discourse. That I personally thought a lot of it was just garbage. People making wild, bombastic claims without ever watching it, which is insane to me. Like, you got to watch the damn thing. And it bummed me out a little bit because, like, I feel like 10 years ago, if I knew there was a Tolkien show coming on, whether or not it was good or not, I would have been excited.
Oh yeah.
And I just felt tired, and that really bothers me.
I also wonder how much of this criticism and this, this kind of negative discourse is because of people just wanted attention. How do they really think this, or is it just a way to shine the spotlight on themselves?
It's an interesting question there, I think, too, from the perspective of a creator, whether it's a show or you're a writer writing a book. And I wonder what you think of this, Mr. Erikson. On the one hand, you want to listen to fans and what works well and all that. But on the other hand, it could be, as Jimmy says, I'm sure, exhausting to listen to, especially when you feel like, oh my God, they're twisting it around and they're turning. I mean, so and that's something I think you, as a creative person, you have to find a way to cope with, don't you?
Sure, but I would argue that all of you who are going on YouTube and discussing things, you have entered into the same public arena,
Yeah.
where you are as vulnerable as an author or any artist, or actor or whatever. And so, in a respect, that there's no such thing as a safe place. Once you're in the public domain, you're fair game, and at times unfair game, because you just happen to be there.
Yeah.
So if people are driven by particular agendas, then you have a target painted on you, potentially. As I mentioned, I was talking with AP, and I call it the age of melodrama. Last when we were having a conversation, he's been dropping the phrase ever since. But that's how it feels. It's we're driven to extremes, and the algorithm methods of these channels are also attuned to those extremes, and so it generates itself. It's a natural product of how the algorithms work. That rage and anger and hate are magnetic in terms of attention.
Yeah.
And so it generates itself. And the only way you can fight against it is to keep doing what you're doing. Keep the discourse civil, enjoy yourselves, deliver positive energy rather than negative, because it's the negative stuff that clings to us.
Yeah.
And it's why I think a lot of writers just have to, for their own sanity, stay away from engagement, because that negativity, it's wounding. It's, and I'm sure if you guys have had negative comments on your sites, you know what it's like. It's not fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's this wonderful feature on YouTube where you can block
I know
a person if it gets too obnoxious. So it's like,
well, the writers can't. That's the problem.
You can't do that. Yeah.
No.
I've been very fortunate, probably because I am a smaller channel, but it's also fortunate though that I've been able to find people like these three, like Steve Talks Books and Jimmy Nuts and Philip Chase, people who are setting a positive example in the community.
Yeah, and what I'm impressed with is the commentary generally that I see. Obviously, you may be blocking stuff, but the commentary I see is extremely positive. And engaged, and so you're doing a great job. For that reason, it's getting people out and enjoying talking about the things they like. That's that's all a good thing. It's all a good thing.
Yeah, especially when you look at the rest of YouTube, because I mean, everything in the world's covered on YouTube. There's a lot of just spaces that are super negative. I feel like definitely in the book community, we tend to get the more thoughtful people, above average human beings.
There's more of a time investment.
It's true.
So.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
Yeah, I mean, how many places do you find people talking for 2 or 3 hours about books and the stuff that we're talking about? I don't think that's the norm. I don't have a great sense of what's going on in the rest of YouTube, other than tennis highlights. But my guess is that we're a bit weird, right?
Yeah.
I
think so.
You think?
Can
Think, Philip?
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
But it's fun. We're having a blast.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is what you put out. I mean, if you...
That's true.
What you put out is what you get back in. So if you are constantly negative or you have rant or whatever, you're gonna get those kind of people respond to it, and it's gonna just be a cycle.
Yeah, I think Alan's actually a really good example of someone who is extraordinarily passionate about what his opinions are, but Alan still brings a positive energy. And I think that's one of the reasons why I admire him so well. or so much rather. It's because he does it so well.
He does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he does.
Shoes.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, he's one of a kind. He's just one of a kind guy.
He really is.
He really is. Yeah, he's great. Yeah, definitely. But yes, we are weird.
Oh, Paul. Oh dear.
And I just wanted to ask Mr. Erikson a question about Malazan. It has a reputation of being, complex, or being, I think some readers are intimidated by it. So if a reader came to you and said, I'm going to start the series, what advice would you give to them?
Oh man. Just keep going, the first book is setting the table in many respects, but it's also lining up as many tropes as it possibly could and kicking them all down. So that was kind of the exercise there, and I had great fun doing it, but it gets more serious with Dead House Gates.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if you come away from Dead House Gates, I guess appreciating the book, then you'll probably be okay.
Yeah.
And you can keep going.
Yeah, that's well said.
Yeah, the farther I get into the series, the more I love Guardians of the Moon. The farther I get, the more I
Yep.
and I loved it the first time, but the farther I get, the more I look back on it and the things that happened. And
That's a really amazing thing about the series, is it will get you to look back at, the further you get, the more you look back at previous books and storylines, and you suddenly have more context for them, or they just sink in deeper somehow.
Yeah, I think House of Chains for me was the one that aged the best. When I finished the series, like thinking back on it and just like where things end up, I'm just like, man, that book was excellent.
Yeah.
Which, I know like Memories of Ice is very, very beloved, right? Like I see people just love it so much, but I remember reading House of Chains and at first being like, wow, kind of a reset in some ways, and not a reset, but just different, right?
Yeah.
And then finishing it and be like, why don't more people talk about this and this ending?
Yeah.
It got me.
It got me too.
I was on a plane back from Vegas. I remember when I finished reading it, and
Wow.
it tear did. Yeah, I guess I cry a lot when I read Malazan.
I cry a lot too. Yeah.
Like,
Constantly.
I'm
Yeah,
definitely
the
getting more
comic-
sentimental with age, but man, the whole series made
I'm
me
a
cry
weeper.
multiple times.
Well, I mean, Memories of Ice with Dead House Gates, Gardens, Dead House, and Memories, the climactic scenes were being ramped up. And I felt I'd almost gone as high as I could with Memories of Ice. And I did not want to try to up that in scale with the next one, because that would set the precedent of constantly trying to, raise the stakes. And that's, I realized early that was going to be impossible, because I knew that Memories of Ice finished with quite a few knockout punches, I think, and was very, very cinematic and huge in scale. So there's no way I could keep upping that scale. I knew I thought I could probably match it by the end, by hopefully Gardens of the Moon. Crippled God's conclusion. But that would have felt anticlimactic if I tried to push and push and push for that high cinema kind of endings. So I decided to flip it with House of Chains.
Good,
And
though.
I brought it right down to the human level,
Yes.
individual level between two people. Yeah.
Absolutely perfect. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I think it was like when I was reading that particular book, there's been a lot of conversation in our community, or there was at the time, about rating books, whether through star ratings or ranking the books, and where do you rank the Malazan books, which one's your favorite, and that kind of thing. And I think it was that book that kind of broke my head, and I was like, I can't reduce these books to a simple rating or ranking, and I still feel that way. it broke my head in that sense. But I love the fact that you took a different direction with that book. For me, it was brilliant the way it came together, and it was so intimate. And yeah, it just couldn't have ended any other way for me. It was perfect.
Well, it also served within the series. It negated expectation, right? Because
Yeah.
the other ones had me doing that, and then I flip it, so it kind of levels everything out, and that allowed me then to completely shift and go to Midnight Tides, which was in a completely different setting, tell a new story. So
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me every book in the series is structurally a little bit different. Like you're doing something different, and
I love that.
I love that, and
Yeah.
I'd imagine that is largely deliberate. Or
yeah. And wait till you get to No Life Forsaken. Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, The God Is Not Willing has not prepared you for this book. Take my word for it. No.
Okay, so you're pulling another Midnight Tides on us here or something.
Now
I
I
don't know
feel
what-
like a false fan here. Is No Life Forsaken? Is that the second in the Witness trilogy? Or
Yeah, it's what I'm writing right now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
No, there's. I don't even know if there's a comparison with this. I don't even know what the hell I'm doing with it. It is just. Niflrog's going to go crazy when he reads this one.
Oh,
It's gonna
good.
happen.
Great. He's a
He's
genius.
great.
So it'll be cool to see him go crazy.
He will. Yeah, he's going to be tearing his hair out, guaranteed.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, they were commenting on AP's recent video earlier in the chat. PL had made a good comment about it, and I have to admit that Professor Fireballs did make a couple good points there.
Is this the 8?
Yes.
Yeah.
Misconceptions or whatever.
Eight-ish misconceptions.
Yeah,
I
that
lost
was-
track
that-
while he was talking, but
That was great. That was
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
That was a fantastic video.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. But I also think he mentioned how the reread thing, like, oh, you have to reread the series, and I love the way he addressed that, actually.
Yeah.
Having just reread it myself, but I thought he made an excellent point about approaching it and not with the fact that you're going to get a ton out of it on the first read and enjoy what you're getting out of it while you do that, right, Johanna? Yeah.
Yes. So did Jimmy, so.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I had a question from Nathan, Trill Nathan. I'm currently reading the Conan stories. When you said to read up on Howard's life, did you have a specific book or biography in mind,
Yeah.
or did you just mean in general?
Did I have a book called The Howard Reader? Rings a bell. I think it was called The Howard Reader. And it provided biographical information. I think that's where I got it from. But I mean, there's not a lot there. There's a lot of it is drawn from letters that he wrote to his fellow pulp writers, including Lovecraft, I think. But he did a lot of writing back and forth with various other writers, and those those were saved, I guess, by the recipients. But it sounded like a pretty. I think some people were thinking that had he continued, he would have left fantasy and sword and sorcery behind. He would not have continued with Conan. That he was heading more towards writing westerns and horror film westerns and comedic westerns.
Yeah, there is the Robert E. Howard Reader. There is a book. So.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
Nice.
Yeah, I think I've got it lying around somewhere.
I love what little I've read of the Conan stories, and I would just shout out to anybody in the chat if you're interested in Robert E. Howard or Burroughs or Lovecraft, and I highly recommend the channel Michael K. Vaughan. He is like a Robert E. Howard expert. He has videos on his channel every week on Robert E. Howard, and just speaks beautifully about his life and about his writing and about the stories. It's a fantastic channel.
Cool.
Yeah. There is. Mike had a question. Do you have any advice for coming up with book titles that are so unique, from Gardens of the Moon to No Life Forsaken?
No Life Forsaken came out of a poem I wrote, which I'm probably going to scrap, but that one line survived. Yeah, titles that's interesting. I mean, I had the titles for the 10 books even before I started Gardens of the Moon, I think. Not including Gardens of the Moon, because Cam and I came up with that one for the script, film script version. No, I don't know. Quite often, I know when I was writing short stories, non-fantasy, contemporary fiction stuff, my titles generally referred to thematic elements rather than anything else.
Well, that strongly suggests how much you thought about the themes before you wrote the books, because the titles are often so much a signpost about or are reiterating a lot of the important themes in there. Dust of Dreams and
and most of them are iterated in a previous book.
Yep. There's always these echoes. There's these echoes throughout. So you really thought that through, didn't you? Wow.
I had the titles.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I find that so interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
And Jason had a question. Have you ever done any of your own illustrations for the Malazan series?
Well, there's crop, but I get the ambition to do so on occasion. But when I'm writing, I'm not painting or drawing. They draw from the same well, and so probably when I finish all my novels and decide that's it as a writer, I'll go back to my paints and pick up oils again and start exploring that kind of stuff. But
will you be using ochre by any chance?
You would not believe how much I use yellow ochre. I have two Marines in No Life Forsaken who spend almost a page and a half discussing ochre, just to really push the point home.
I love it.
Great.
And what would be something that your readers would be surprised to learn about you?
About me?
Yeah.
I don't know. I have no idea. Surprised.
I think a lot of people are surprised when they learn that you were a fencer.
That was gonna be mine.
Yeah. I started at 18 in order to rehabilitate some groin damage from being a goaltender in hockey.
Ooh.
That sounds painful.
And somebody said, well, fencing will strengthen that area and rehabilitate that. So I got into fencing, and I only stopped about 7 years ago when I partial tear of a hamstring during a lunge. So I've not gone back to it. I think I'm probably too old now to actually go back to it. Well, maybe not. I don't know. And that certainly helps with choreographing fight sequences and that kind of thing. So fencing, I used to teach rock climbing, freestyle rock climbing.
Oh, wow.
I taught canoeing, and worked with YMCA and did canoe trips, 2-week trips, 1 3-week trip.
There is a teacher in you, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, and I have taught. There were a couple of archaeological work field schools where I lectured on lithics for the class.
Is that like rocks?
And then writing as well. Sorry?
That means rocks, right?
That means, well, it's a type of rock, yes. Yeah.
And you've done writing workshops too, of course.
Yeah.
He essentially gave one on Chatting with Nuts. Many people have messaged me and said that I can't believe that was free. I said, me either.
I my enthusiasm for writing takes over at that point. So why would I want to charge anything for that? If I can spread that enthusiasm to just one other person out there, then I'm happy.
Yeah.
Well, you definitely did that day.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Good.
Works
And
for
this-
free. You definitely are a teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the talks you've been having on AP's channel too, like the one about
yeah.
dialogue and
It's a gold mine.
yeah, that was fantastic.
Yeah, we have quite a few. We're going to go through narrative structure basically. So we started with the most basic elements, separating prose from poetry,
Yeah.
and trying to recontextualize that word because it's been overused and quite often used wrongly. And then we went straight to, well, what's prose made up of? Well, it's exposition and dialogue. And so we ended up having to split that. So our next one will be on exposition.
Nice.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, your conversation about that, I believe Essamont was on for that as well. Really eye-opening as someone who reviews, and I do always try to touch on prose. And what I really meant to say all the while was style is really what I meant to say.
Yeah. I think mostly it's style. I think that's what people are meaning. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Severian makes a good point here. Do you think you'd ever be tempted to pull a John Gardner or a Stephen King?
Yeah, but my thoughts on it, I've been writing sort of essays about my archaeology days and quite autobiographical. And I thought, can I actually blend that into a book on what I would call the ritual of writing? Because I view it as a ritual in every respect, anthropologically as a ritual as well. So I have had that in mind. And so, if once finished all the fiction, then I could probably start assembling that and put a book together.
Is that the title going to be? Ritual of Writing?
Yeah.
I love it.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Now somebody will steal it. You'll see.
Yeah.
You better copyright it right now.
Yeah.
Better watch out for Philip. He'll do anything to get published these days. I mean, I did have a question about writing. If you would be so kind to answer, and it pertains to like scope of whenever you're starting out. Do you think it is an error to go all out and say, like someone who wants to write a Malazan, right, or something major? Do you feel like that is not the best place to start? Do you believe like follow your heart and write the story you really want to tell, or do you think that there are building blocks that would help you succeed to that point?
Well, you have to write the story you want to tell. The scope that you apply to that may actually be, thanks AP, may actually be more a product of where you feel you're at as a writer, because there can be nothing more discouraging than to start a massively ambitious project when you're not ready for it as a writer, craft-wise. When I was the first novel, okay, so this goes back to before I'm writing as Erikson, and I'm writing contemporary fiction. I published, what did I publish? I published a cycle of stories, so all interrelated, and the book was called A Ruin of Feathers. And then I published, I did a 3-day novel contest and tied for first place on that. And so that was the second book. And then I did another collection of short fiction. But the novel I had in mind was this coming of age novel called This River Awakens. And I think I started it in my last year in the workshop here in Victoria, University of Victoria. And I got about 250 pages in and realized I wasn't old enough to write it yet.
Wow.
And because there's a lot of autobiographical stuff in there, but I fictionalized a lot as well. So I put it on the shelf. And it's one of those things where you look back and you think, well, could I have pushed through? I mean, the book was originally, it was dedicated to my mother. And by putting it on the shelf, she never lived to see it. So you make these decisions and you then, you look back and you think, well, could I have done this differently? But looking back, with reason and soberly, no, I could not. I could not have written it before I wrote it. It would I probably would have failed at it quite dramatically. And in many respects, maybe I did anyways. But when I finally got around to writing it, I got down on the page what I wanted. And so sometimes the false starts are, as an important lesson than anything else. And then years later, I'd already written Gardens of the Moon, but it was sitting on the shelf. It had gone to the publishers, been rejected. So this was like 5 years later when I wrote This River Awakens. And we moved to England, and I found a publisher for it because it's set in Canada, which was exotic for the British market. And dusted off Gardens of the Moon, revised it, and because I had the agent at that point, I got Gardens of the Moon to him, and he found a place for it. I don't think I would have been ready to tackle a 10-book series without the experiences of all those short stories that I wrote, and the writing of and the failing of This River Awakens. I think I needed all those things. I needed to have those scars. I needed to carry that stuff in order to, when given the chance, given the privilege of, a 9-book deal after Gardens of the Moon, it just basically gave me a salary for what turned out to be 10 years to write this stuff. That was giving me permission to actually write it. And when I realized that, those opportunities don't come very often, and you've got to take them. You've got to jump and go for it.
Yeah, and that deal was monumental. I think that was like
it was. It's a very unusual deal. Yeah.
People are always surprised when I tell them about it, because I don't think a lot of people know about the deal until they read about it on Wikipedia or whatever. But
I'm trying to think who called me. Was it Financial Times? Something like that. Some really sort of major business newspaper called me to interview me about it, and they wrote an article about it because it was unique in publishing deals in terms of the terminology of it. I wasn't paid per manuscript. I was paid on the assumption that I was going to produce one manuscript, one book a year.
Yeah.
But I was paid in 4 chunks as a salary. Very, very strange. Never repeated. But it put pressure on me because I realized that these guys had made a major commitment towards me, and there was no way I was going to fuck that up. So I just bore down and started writing. And Memories of Ice took a year longer than expected because we moved back to Canada in the middle of all that. And that kind of messed up my pacing. But generally, I think I produced one a year.
Sounds like you had a great agent too, to be able to help get a deal like that.
Well, no, he was more surprised than I was.
Oh,
No, it was a rival publisher actually tried to poach me after the first book.
Huh.
And so it was their offer, and then it was a question of whether Bantam UK would match it.
So the bidding war. Yeah.
Well, it wasn't really bidding. It's just were they going to match it? And I broke the rules. I wasn't supposed to talk to my editor at all, but I phoned him and said, "Just get close. I don't want to. I don't want to leave because this was the guy, and these were the publishers that took me the first time. The other ones had passed by on Gardens of the Moon.
Yeah.
And then when the book got popular was when they sort of said, "Oh well, let's change our minds on this one." And I did not want. And apparently, I didn't know enough about the industry, but that would have really screwed my reputation had I jumped.
Huh.
So I'm glad I didn't. And I have no regrets there because I've been lucky enough to have that editor, Simon Taylor, with me through the whole series. To this day, in fact.
Wow. So I guess because you had that contract and that sort of momentum and sort of pressure, like you said, to keep going, I was curious about if you experience any sort of like lull or drop in energy when you complete a book, or do you just keep going to the next thing?
I kept going.
Hmm.
There was no lull. I took a short break between book 9 and 10. I told that story, which was a bit of a mistake. I went to Mongolia. Yeah. But then when I came back, I was raring to go. And I'd lost a lot of weight in Mongolia. So somebody said, well, just drink Guinness. So I started drinking Guinness. and all the weight just showed up in one place, right? It's right down here on my belly. That's what it was. So that didn't work. But anyways, it is nutritious. I'll grant you that. But anyways, then I wrote Crippled God, and it just, again, the momentum was there. But then I started slowing down towards the end of the Crippled God because I started getting worried that the scenes that had been in my head for 10, 15 years, I wouldn't be able to pull off. And so I had to, things got more and more. I remember the scene where I realized how slow I was going. And that's the scene with Tavor and the Children of the Snake.
Mm.
And it's the scene where she has a particular line when she refers to her own blood being spilled. And it took me, on that chapter, it probably took me a week to even get to that line. And that's how carefully I was getting to that point. And then I realized, well, the rest of the book's going to be like this, isn't it? And it was. So it took a while. It took a while to make sure that I got to the scenes that I had in my head, that I could get them down on the page the way I wanted them. Yeah. And then I took 3 weeks off, 2 weeks, and started Forge of Darkness, which was a mistake. I needed a much bigger break. I didn't take it.
Guinness is lovely stuff and no longer filtered through fish guts, so safe for Philip.
That's impressive, though, because I mean, I know like it's very common to have a sort of, for lack of a better way to put it, sort of postpartum experience when you do something really big.
Yeah, no, it was. I had no idea the burden I was carrying until I finished the book, Crippled God, and the pressure that I'd been under for 8 years. I really had no idea that it even existed, and it was manifesting in physical ways, I'm sure. But finishing up, I was in Falmouth in Cornwall, in a cafe just on the high street when I finished. And I remember stepping outside and I almost floated home. It was like, everything had just lifted. And yeah, it was kind of, when you say you're coming out of these books and your headspace is
yes.
I was like that. Yeah. For a few days, I would think. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Whenever I finished one of your books, I would feel like almost like when you come out of a theater and you're surprised it's either light or dark outside. Like that's how I felt. I think the first time I felt that way was with Memories of Ice when I came out of that. Like, what is happening?
Well, then you're channeling my feelings. The writing of the process, the actual process of writing. Yeah.
And PL had a question. What do you find is the most challenging thing about writing?
The most challenging thing about writing. I don't struggle with writing. I've never had like writer's block. I don't know if I can even answer that. I love it so much, and I feel so privileged that I'm able to do this full time. That every time I sit down to write, I just feel lucky that I can do it, that I'm allowed to do it. And so why would why would that be problematic in any sense? No, I can't really think of challenging in that respect.
Wow.
For me, it would be challenging, but I'm happy that it's not for you.
No, it's just so much fun. It's
Yeah.
such a pleasure. You have so much within your reach that you can just put onto the page, pull down and put onto the page, and see where it takes you.
Yeah.
And as you're writing, it's whatever you've created has it did not exist before you put it down on that page.
Yeah.
It simply wasn't there anywhere in the universe, and
That's
so
interesting.
it's just so cool, right?
Yeah.
To be able to do that with the hope and the expectation. Well, it's more the hope these days, that you'll find a readership, that you find people who enjoy what you've done.
Yeah. I used to write in journals all the time and trying to get back into it. But I used to, like, for years and years, all throughout my youth, I would just write and write and write every day, just about my life, my experiences. And it was always interesting to me because I'd always go back and read what I'd written after I'd finished writing. And it always ended up coming to a closure at the end without me even trying. There was just some sort of cadence that would come out. And I always thought that was interesting. Like, I guess part of me was trying to make sense of my life and putting some kind of narrative lens on it through writing.
Yeah. Well, we do that, don't we? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we narrativize our lives. Absolutely.
And we're always the good guys.
It's true. Yeah. Yeah. At that time, I think that was kind of what got me away from journaling for a while, is I realized I was, in a way, trying to manipulate my experience or my perception of myself by doing that. And so for a while there, I kind of felt like I needed to stop doing that just to break that a little bit, to see what I'd see. But I am trying to kind of explore it again because it's, I think, a really important sort of exploration too.
I mean, if it's a reflection of what's going on in your head, then you're already reordering experiences, right? We all do it. Right?
Yeah.
We revise our memories and our stories. Although, it depends on, I guess, levels of one's honesty towards themselves, in terms of how much you want to revise, how much you need to revise. I mean, experiences sometimes require you to do so. Favorite film? Single film? Good grief.
Or top 5 even.
Well, let's see. I loved Amadeus.
That's a fantastic movie.
I'm a huge fan of Milos Forman, filmmaker. I loved Ran, Kurosawa. Comedy, I would say Top Secret is probably the best comedy ever written.
AP just wrote in the chat.
He already he beat you to it, actually.
Oh, that hoser! It's brilliant.
I don't even know what that is. I should look it up.
It's like an 80s comedy, isn't it?
It's from the makers of Airplane. So if that kind of humor.
Okay.
I
vaguely remember that title from a top list of
Airplane?
movies. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really terrible when it comes to film. I'm so bad at knowing anything when it comes to movies.
I'm trying to remember. I saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the cinema in Winnipeg. And that one I floated out of the cinema there. That was wonderful. It was so optimistic. What a change, right? To have something optimistic for a change.
I know.
Brilliant. I think Platoon is an extraordinary film.
I know I've seen that probably multiple times, and I just can't think of what it think about it.
I mean, I might say Apocalypse Now, but I watched it once, and I've had no desire to watch it again. So that may, it was monumental in what it was, but that's not good enough reason to actually go back and watch it a second time, at least for me.
What about you guys? What are your favorite films?
Well, I mean, the default answer is Lord of the Rings, just because like it's so monumental for my life. But from like an adult perspective, I would say The Wrestler by Aronofsky with Mickey Rourke. I think it's Offnar. Is that how you say it? I don't know how to say his name. Yeah, The Wrestler. It's phenomenal. Fantastic movie. There's a lot of truth in that movie. It's really good.
It's a good one.
Yeah, for me, I also, obviously Lord of the Rings too. I loved it, but a film that I think if you haven't seen it, Joanna, you should watch that I love is called Tous les matins du monde. It's a French film, All the Mornings of the World. Jimmy's laughing at me.
I'm just, Philip always got something up his sleeve. Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely going to check it out.
Tous les matins du monde. It's about these French Baroque composers. And it is just a movie that had me just trembling with emotion by the end of it. It's a brilliant film. Gerard Depardieu is in it, and he's a great actor. Also, another movie that I loved because I was a runner, and maybe you'd relate, Joanna, because you are too, was Chariots of Fire.
Oh, yeah.
I heard you say that once before.
Oh, man. I had that movie in my head just about through my entire college years. Just every time I would go running. Music and everything,
Oh, yeah. Vangelis was that's sort of where he made his name, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he did stuff with John Anderson, Friends of Mr. Cairo, which is one of my favorite albums. One of my favorite songs, actually. Yeah. Fantastic song. Yeah.
I see that AP Canavan said Dangerous Liaisons.
He would say that.
I've never seen it, but I know he was talking about, I think Cruel Intentions is the one that's the modern remake of that. I think that was the one.
Yeah.
I did see that one. Chariots of Fire, yay.
For a comedy, I would pick, for a comedy, I'd pick Friday with Ice Cube and Chris Tucker, which is probably, Philip's never seen it, that's for sure.
What?
Yeah, exactly. It's fantastic, though.
I need to just start a film list so I could start watching a bunch of films I haven't seen because I'm the worst. I really haven't watched anything. In high school, I watched the original Star Wars trilogy over and over again. And
Star brilliant.
Yeah.
It's worth it. But Immortal Beloved is another one. It's a movie about Beethoven.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's brilliant. With, what's the actor's name? Oh, he's so good. Gary, is it? No, not. Oh gosh, I can't.
Gary Oldman? Is it Gary
Yes,
Oldman?
Gary Oldman. Thank you. Yeah.
Very prolific. Well, I know some of you have early mornings tomorrow. I don't want to keep you too long. I want to respect your time. But before we go, I wanted to ask Mr. Erikson a question I like to ask all of my guests is, I think you can learn a lot about someone from what their first job was. What was your first job?
Busboy. You learned something from that? I don't know.
What did you learn from that?
Oh, well, man. I think everybody should actually have a job as serving in a restaurant, waiting tables, in a bar. If you want an educational experience, that's the place for it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I want to thank everyone for coming by, and of course all of you for spending your Friday nights with me. I know you're all busy. I really appreciate you coming by and spending some time with us. So Jimmy, where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
I would say just to get on here on YouTube, the Fantasy Network, and I do my thing over there. We have a lot of fun. I'd love to have you.
Yeah, definitely. Joanna, where can people find you?
Well, my channel's name is Johanna. I know that's not very creative. I'm sorry. But yeah, I can be found there.
And,
yeah,
Steve,
yeah.
I'm sorry, Philip, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say you can find me at Philip Chase on YouTube. Yep. Yeah.
Here's my crooked glass from Vegas.
Oh, you brought it.
Hey.
That's cool.
Yay.
Yes.
Nice.
It's awesome.
You can't find me at all, so that's okay.
Yeah. Can confirm. Yes. So thanks again to everyone in the chat, and of course, again to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and kind of just shoot the breeze. So really appreciate it. So hope everyone has a great weekend, and we will talk to everyone soon.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you.